Hello everybody, I'm Sean, and today I want to talk about how to stop unwanted thoughts. Now, through trauma and through the healing process, a lot of unwanted thoughts come up in our mind, repressed memories, past events that happened, negative, intrusive thoughts that seem so uncontrollable and we can't get rid of them, right? And these are thoughts that we don't want. These are thoughts that hurt us, that are painful, that are keeping us trapped, right? That feel like they're holding us back, right? It feels so powerful that we can't move, right? These thoughts are essentially taking over our whole life, and it's just too much, right? So it feels like these unwanted thoughts that we don't want, right, are controlling us. So how do you get rid of these type of thoughts, and how do you get rid of unwanted thoughts in general? How do you stop unwanted thoughts? Now, a lot of times we have thought looping, right? Thoughts that come repetitively over and over again, right? And we're aware that we don't want these thoughts. We're aware of the thought, right? We know what it is. It's just that once we get awareness of it, it seems to come more, right? And it seems to just loop, and it comes to us over and over again. It keeps hitting our mind over and over again to the point where we don't have any control and we don't know when it's going to happen, right? It gives us anxiety because we don't know when these thoughts are going to come up and, cause us to be triggered or, have an overwhelming experience, right? So a lot of sexual trauma survivors and people who were in an abusive family and left, or an abusive relationship and survived through that and left, that type of stuff, they have this, right? They have thought loops, right? A lot of sexual trauma people have loops, right, of what happened in that event, what happened that day, what happened that night, thoughts about that person, right? Thoughts about how they felt, emotions, in abusive families, you have voices in your head sometimes that you hear, right, that essentially take over you, and the past becomes the now, right, because you're just listening to those voices that you don't want to hear, but they keep telling you what to do, and it's like you don't know what else to do, right? It feels like you don't know anything else but your pain and your trauma from these unwanted thoughts. So a lot of times we think of thoughts that we don't want, right? And a lot of times from this, we try to not think of the thoughts, right? Because we realize from being aware of these thoughts that we don't want it, right? So we try to run away from it, and we try to think about not thinking about these thoughts, right? And what this actually does is brings the unwanted thoughts more into our mind and keeps it there, right? And that's essentially how, like I was saying, thought looping happens, because we're thinking so much of not doing something and not wanting the thought, that the thought actually comes more from doing that, right? That's essentially like dealing with a trigger. For example, if you're dealing with a trigger, right, you don't want to do exactly what triggers you, but you don't want to do the exact opposite. You need to have balance, right? Balance is always key. So it's the same thing with getting rid of unwanted thoughts, right? You have to find balance. You have to find where you can find your peace, right? So to get rid of these thoughts is to actually accept them, right, and let them be, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that you feed these thoughts, right, and you let them take control of you and take control of your whole life and your perceptions or your beliefs about who you might be. You don't let them affect you. That's not what I mean by accepting your thoughts. You just let them sit and accept it as just a thought, right? Because a lot of times we're giving these unwanted thoughts so much value by thinking about not wanting these thoughts, right? Because by doing that, we're telling our brain that these thoughts are bad, right? We're overstimulating our amygdala, right? So you're giving these thoughts so much value, right? And your amygdala gets affected, right? And your amygdala is overactivated, because your brain is being so overstimulated, because it's like a clash. It's like fighting fire and water, right? So to have a healthy response to these thoughts and memories, right, you have to stop giving these thoughts so much value. You have to stop giving these thoughts so much internal value, right? You have to stop giving these thoughts so much anxiety, right? You're giving yourself anxiety through these unwanted thoughts because you're creating fear by not wanting it, because like I said about the amygdala, that overstimulates your brain, which overactivates the amygdala, because the amygdala is a part of the brain that recognizes these emotions, that recognizes these thoughts, right? From beliefs comes thoughts, then comes feelings, right? So if you have a belief about not wanting these thoughts, right, and you're creating fear about facing these thoughts or having these thoughts, right, you're overstimulating your amygdala, you're flooding your limbic system, which will cause more panic, and it's causing so much resistance, right, which will essentially cause tension just in life and in the body and in the mind, right? You won't be able to sit still, right, because you're giving so much value to these thoughts, right? So all you really need to do to get rid of these unwanted thoughts is to accept them as just thoughts, right? Just like any other thought, right? That's what these unwanted thoughts should be treated like. And therefore, right, by doing this, then your brain won't be overstimulated and your amygdala will stay healthy, and you'll be having a healthy response to these thoughts and memories, because it's all about your response, right, to triggers, to trauma, right? It's not about doing the opposite and completely avoiding it, right? That's a defense mechanism, right? But sometimes if you get too attached to that, that becomes like running away, which is never healthy, right? So if you're running away from your thoughts, the more and more your thoughts will come back for you, right? The more and more you run away from the mind, the more and more the mind comes for you, right? So just sit with these thoughts, right? The only thing that deserves value is what you choose that deserves value, right? So you have control over your value, right? Over your priorities, right? If these thoughts are taking over your life, it's probably because you're giving that thoughts, right? You're giving these negative thoughts, these unwanted thoughts, a priority, right? That's all you're focusing on, not wanting these thoughts. So you're freezing, right? Because you're so anxious, you're so hyper aware, right? Which is actually taking you away, right? Disassociating yourself, right? You don't want to just push these thoughts away. In fact, through depression, through trauma, you actually want to accept these unwanted thoughts, these unwanted memories, right? Because you don't want to hide from pain, you don't want to hide from depression, you don't want to hide from what you're facing, right? So accept it. But one mistake that I made is that when I tried to accept these thoughts, I fed them and I ended up just getting fucked up again, right? So you really have to have balance, because during trauma, it's not about doing all of it or none of it, right? You don't do neither of that, right? That's a trauma response, all or none, like thinking black or white, like there's a right or wrong, right? There is not necessarily no right or wrong, but all thoughts will always just be thoughts, right? And by giving these so much value, you're putting these thoughts on a higher pedestal, which is putting yourself in like an alternate world, right? These thoughts become your world, right? Because you're giving it so much value, right? So there's no point of trying to suppress these thoughts, right? Like I said, that could lead to disassociation, which can be unhealthy, and also it could lead to a dysregulation of your emotions and imbalance your stimuli and dopamine deficiency, because by holding these thoughts, right, and putting it in this sort of bubble, like I don't want this, right, you're going to imbalance your stimuli because you're holding back thoughts, which essentially is making yourself numb, right? You're holding back thoughts that you don't want. You're not accepting your pain. You're numbing yourself out, right? Or that's what you're trying to do, which is actually making you crash even harder, right? When it does happen, right? Because you can only hold on for so long. That's one thing I've learned, is that, as much as I try to disassociate, as much as I try to run away, it'll always come back for me. So I always just have to face it, no matter what. So why even bother trying to run away, right? But that doesn't mean go full on, right? Just find peace and just be, right? And have balance, right? So that is how you stop unwanted thoughts, right? Is to not necessarily even try to stop them, right? Because when people hear that, how to stop unwanted thoughts, to stop negative thoughts, they think, oh, to just make their mind go blank. No, see, that's wrong. That's like letting go in the wrong way, because you're actually letting go in a way that you're just avoiding, right? You're using avoidance as your defense mechanism, right? Essentially, you're creating all these walls, right, that you're building up, which will eventually come back for you later, and when it does, it'll hurt harder, right, than it should, right? Because you built up so much that when it all comes back for you, it's all crashing down, right? All the stuff that you've numbed yourself out and all built yourself, all these defense mechanisms that you've built up, you've gone so far away from yourself, right? Which we don't want, right? So, yeah. So that's how you stop unwanted thoughts.